Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. Voice AI has seen rapid growth since its evolution in 2011, starting with Siri. Since then, a lot had happened in the space from a technology, use case, adoption, utility, and user mindset standpoint. In today's episode, Shyamala Prayaga speaks with Bret Kinsella about the current and future trends of conversational AI. Bret is the founder, CEO, and research director of Voicebot.ai. He was named Commentator of the Year by the Alexa Conference in 2019 and is widely cited in media and academic research as an authority on voice assistants and AI. He is also the host of the Voicebot Podcast and editor of the Voice Insider newsletter. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to The Future is Spoken. Today I have a very special guest with me, Bret Kinsella. People who don't know Bret, he is the founder and CEO of Voicebot.ai. And Voicebot is a leading research analysis company focusing more on voice tech industry. That's right?
Yes, sure. Voice AI is the way
Voice
we talk about it. Yep.
Yeah. Welcome, Bret. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much, Shyamala.
Yeah. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how did you get into the voice industry?
Sure. By accident. I've worked in new technology since the mid 90s, but wasn't necessarily looking to get into voice. I'd been looking at AI, but frankly, a friend of mine had founded a company and was looking for some assistance. So I started helping them out and then wound up becoming a pretty significant amount of my effort for several years. And this was around voice interactive advertising. So the idea is with your phone, when you're listening to music or the radio or something, could you interact with the ads that come up or not without having to take it out of your pocket and all these other pieces, which are these other steps that introduce friction. And so voice interactivity, so a prompt and then being able just to respond with your voice, seems like a very logical thing to do. But in practice, it's a lot more complicated than you would think because you have to have microphone permission. You have to then be able to essentially have a speech recognition system and then some NLU in the background, at least at a basic level, in order to be able to do that. And so I had been doing that for several years. And during that period of time, Amazon Echo came out, which was interesting. And that company that I'd been helping out through some friends decided to spend more time in that space. I wrote an article for Advertising Week. It got popular. And all of a sudden I realized when I was doing research in that space, there wasn't really a central source of data or a lot of consolidated information around it. And the data that I did find, I thought was very shallow. And the analysis really wasn't that good. And it wasn't necessarily because of the people that were doing it. It was because they weren't focused on it. This was just like one of many things that they were doing. They were analyzing lots of things or news coverage of lots of things. They didn't really understand it. And I had enough experience at that point, having been in the industry for several years and having had the context of seeing a number of other related technology cycles. I said, oh, okay, well, I can do some of this. And it just, frankly, people said, hey, where'd you get your research? I said, oh, I can just throw it up in a website so you can find it really easily. Maybe I'll write an article once a week or maybe a couple times a month. But that was in September of 2016, September 15th, 2016. And what happened right after that was API.ai got acquired. Echo Dot came out. It was launched in Europe. Then Viv Labs was bought by Samsung. This all happened within about 3 or 4 weeks. And then Google Assistant, Google Home formally launched. They'd been announced previously that it was going to come out, but people didn't really know when it was going to happen. So it came out in that October. And so within a month, I was like, oh, well, geez, there's actually a lot going on here. It's not something that you can just handle once a week. And so it was just really, again, serendipity that there was a need. And I started hearing from people in the industry, people I didn't know were reaching out to me. And it just snowballed from there.
Wow, what a journey. Believe me, when I started my journey, I was looking at a lot of your research documents, and it kind of helped a lot because you focus your research on all the different industry, and it's not tied to one specific. So you had for automotive, you had for the smart speaker in general, and how the industry is doing, voice and marketing, and all of these things. And it has been really helpful for me as an individual, definitely. So I'm sure that must be the case. But you have created something very useful for people. So when you think about research in general, so what approach do you take? Are these based on the surveys and stuffs like that, or there's more to it, like you do more quantitative and qualitative mix kind of thing? And with your audience, is it just focused on one area like US, or do you do research everywhere?
Okay, so let's start with audience first. So we do focus on people who are either in the industry or going to be deploying mostly on the supply side of this. So they're going to create bots, they're going to provision them, they're going to be doing content. So a lot of people in conversational UI, a lot of engineering, software engineering developers, company founders, and then a lot of the bigger companies that actually have some of these capabilities, either from a software layer standpoint or an actual assistant. So those are the primary folks, and we consider our audience global, and we consider this market global. Now, I think we're one of the few people who actually cover China too, but I think for the most part, when you look at voice AI technologies, AI itself is it has some different dynamics, but when I'm just talking about the voice assistant and AI technologies, there's basically China and the rest of the world. It's a pretty easy way to break it down. Now, it's not quite that clean because there are some regions that are sort of underserved, and through governments and some enterprising entrepreneurs, those are starting to get filled in, some of those gaps. But for the most part, my audience is really focused on mostly on what we'd call the West. And in that, I consider like South Asia would consider that. So anything that's not really China, because China has its own set of competitors. Now, we do cover China as well, but not as in-depth. And so that's the first thing I would say, just in terms of audience, and we're trying to serve that group as well as we can. And the distinction there is we're not really focused on consumers. So you might read, The Verge or 9 to 5 Google or something like that. They're really talking to the consumer side. We're talking to the industry side. So I think that's the first thing. In terms of data, we tend to be more quantitative focused. And that's just a bias I bring with me from my past work. I've been through the rise of the web, particularly the e-commerce side of that, but also more broadly, the rise of the web. I've been through the technology such as RFID and social media, and then more recently, mobile. And I've also seen some other segments that haven't done quite as well. And to me, the factor that you always have to look at is their uptake. So is there going to be adoption? And then what does that adoption look like? And there's different types of adoption. There's concentrated adoption, there's fragmented adoption. But I always look at that first to know whether it's worth spending time, really, because there's a lot of things out there. So, I think AR and VR have been said to be like the next big thing for a long time. And they may eventually get there. So sometime those people might be right. But I think for the most part, people have been disappointed with that. And what you just look at is the demand side isn't there. Now, you could say the supply side isn't there as well. Okay, could be a fair statement. But when I look at it, really quantitative on the demand side, and then looking at how the supply side is supporting that. And then from there, we move on a little bit into some of the more subjective areas where we start to think about market structure and such.
It's kind of cool. So yeah, I mean, definitely your research is more focused on industries in general as well. So why did the idea come to you that you should be focusing on all of those?
Oh, and the different sectors? Well, it's a horizontal technology, and so necessarily it winds up being in a lot of different areas. I will say that there are a couple things that when we first started, I avoided. And so I didn't really focus on the call center, and I did not focus on chatbots in particular, because to me, those were more mature. I didn't really see a lot of the innovation happening. This was back in 2016. And they also had pretty decent coverage in the marketplace. People had already looked at them. Chatbot's another one. People thought we're going to be the next big platform. Didn't quite turn that out. But they're going to get a second life because now they're all adding voice. And so that's going to give them a little bit more energy and momentum behind them. So I didn't focus on those. I focused mostly on the new thing first, and really just to make sure I serve that community well. And then I'd always assumed that there would be some convergence at some point. So chat and voice have essentially started to converge. It was accelerated last year. So we really started to pick up, and we've covered chat here and there throughout the time, but we're certainly covering that a lot more now. And we're covering a lot more in the call center now, is starting last year as well. So those are some areas, but as you think about conversational AI in general, right? And where it's used. That's the way we think about it, because it's that horizontal layer. And even now it's expanding further because we're clearly seeing it in the virtual human space. And so that's a whole nother area that's really closely related and uses the technology, but isn't historically thought of as like Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri or something like that. And then the other thing that a lot of people have been talking about recently is social audio, which I think kind of like podcasting has been an adjacency because the audio component and the tools and voice AI are actually good at analyzing it. So I look at these as complementary trends. They don't necessarily intersect, but we've even increased coverage on social audio as well, because it looks to me like the tooling and the capabilities associated with voice AI are going to be very important supplements to both of those industries.
So one of your research was focusing more on voice and marketing kind of thing. And people have been looking at voice as a marketing tool and creating their own voice skills or flash briefings and stuff like that, right? With these social audio platforms like Clubhouse, do you feel like it will add on as another layer of social marketing or voice marketing, or do you feel like the flash briefing and other things will back off?
I believe it will be another layer of marketing, but it's going to be, it's not, I wouldn't call it voice marketing necessarily. There's maybe some intersection here. I think it's still social media marketing. However, the tools will come from voice AI. There'll be voice technology tools that'll be used to track that activity, to analyze it, to make better decisions, and maybe to automate certain components of it. So what we're seeing right now with the rise of social audio, I think, is very rudimentary compared to where it's going to be in the next 2 years. And it is moving very quickly. That normally I'd think that the evolution is going to be 5 or 6 years for a market like this. And there will be an evolution there, but I think that there's going to be very accelerated evolution over the next 24 months because it's going to be so competitive. So, when we look at it, I definitely think of them as different and can exist without the other. But together, there's a lot of complementary solutions they can deliver and should actually both be stronger as a result.
Yeah, I mean, just recently when I joined Clubhouse, I was there very active for a couple of weeks, but gradually my utility dropped down and I got too busy, or I was like, forget it. So those kind of things will also happen, right? And the same thing happens with voice assistants as well. Like when initially Alexa and Google was launched, people were super excited about it and they wanted to use it all the time.
Right.
And although they have 100,000 plus skills now, not all of them are being used. And part of that is discoverability, but major part of that thing is maybe people don't have interest. So what kind of trends have you seen in that aspect?
Trends in terms of social audio use or in terms of voice
In terms of utility?
For voice assistants?
Yeah.
Well, utility is the operative word here. That's what people are using voice assistants for. I think there's a lot of people who have this idea or maybe hope that these will be engaging conversational personas in the home that we'll consider to be a member of the family. And frankly, that's not how humans are actually looking at this. Maybe there's a few. And I wouldn't discount people thinking of Alexa like a friend or in the home that they can talk to and maybe fights off loneliness. But that doesn't mean anybody actually thinks of it as a human. There are a lot of things that we do that are of human-like contact, which we understand intuitively, innately, that it's not human contact, but we look at it differently. And so essentially, these are utilities. People are using smart speakers and smartphones for voice assistants on both surfaces, very utilitarian ways. They're starting music, asking questions, they're asking about the weather, maybe they're getting directions if they're in the car. They're certainly doing timers and alarms and other things that are just much more efficient to do than the affordance that we had through maybe a smartphone or something else before that, touching buttons and opening apps and those types of things. So I always think of voice assistants first is the utility, and that's the capability that's broken through. And there are some killer apps in there. People seem to be waiting for their killer apps. They're already there. There's widespread adoption of them. I think the next thing that we're thinking about is what comes after that. what are the sort of the new applications that aren't really just a more efficient delivery of things that we could do before on these other surfaces, but are new to the world and really wouldn't have existed without voice.
Yeah, this brings in a lot of questions. So the first question is, you mentioned people don't want human, like they don't expect the assistant to be more human like, right? But we have seen trends, or we have seen data where people are seeking mental help, or people are asking their voice assistant to marry them and things like that on the user side, right? And on the industry side, people are trying to make these synthetic voices more human by adding more emotions and all of those things. So why do you think that is the case?
Why do I think that people are trying to make these more human-like?
Yeah, I mean, first, the companies, why they are actually trying to make it more human like, when users don't think about these as a human.
From a publisher standpoint, so the people that are supplying the assistants or the voice app experiences, what they're interested in is providing a good experience for the user. And a good experience generally would be something that's used more frequency or for longer duration, or maybe some combination of the both. So they're incentivized to do that. And if you just think of a subjective term like a customer satisfaction score, they also see that the more human-like they make it, the more natural the conversation, the better their customer ratings are, their customer sat scores are going to be. So they have a lot of incentives along those lines, aside from anything else that they might be there motivating them. From a consumer standpoint, it actually reinforces this, because what we find is that consumers do react very favorably, with some exceptions, to the more human-like interface. The idea of having a persona actually helps with at least a certain percentage of the population. We have a bell curve, right? So there are people who probably completely anthropomorphize voice assistants, really think of them as a being, want to have that relationship with them as if it's a substitute for a human, and might actually blur the reality. But I would consider them to be the extreme outliers, right? Humans are very good actually at adapting and adjusting to these types of environments, as we've seen. And really, it's just a pleasantness factor, that they like the idea that it's not just, particularly because I think it's voice enabled. They like the fact that it's not just an automaton necessarily on the other side, that very often, if there is a little bit of personality, if it does have some human-like qualities, they naturally fall into engagement mechanisms or engagement patterns that they wouldn't otherwise. And that leads them to have a better experience, give higher ratings, higher customer satisfaction, use it more frequently. So we've seen that, I think, in the data time and again. And I will tell you that we've done some studies on this as well, just on the consumer experience side, where we looked at synthetic and human voices. And people do react more favorably to human voices, recorded human voices. They also react more favorably to synthetic voices that sound more like human voices. And in some cases, the synthetic voices, in our research, the consumers were actually very poor at picking them out. Particularly for short interactions, they have trouble telling. The longer the interaction, the more likely it is they can tell if it's synthetic, if it is in fact synthetic. Although we did have a situation where, probably not surprisingly, some certain percentage of the people that in the focus group that we used, and this was quite large, of several hundred people, they would assign a synthetic label to a human voice, right? So I think that's one of those things that you sort of expect, that maybe they understand what's going on, and maybe there's something about that person that sounds a little bit more robotic. But also, I think the voices for voice assistants have become so good recently that sometimes, or it's more, we will more frequently mistake a human voice for a synthetic voice.
Yeah, I can see that happening. That's an interesting thing, though. Like, people labeling the human voice as synthetic voices, because now they are comparing these two voices and thinking they are so close to each other. There's a lot of process which happens, of course, and I spoke with Rupal about how they design the synthetic voices, and it's a lot of process which is also evolving, which is kind of cool. So as we start thinking about these voices and the expectation and all of those things, if you look at Amazon, the first generation of Amazon was just a smart speaker, which was not enabled for all of the users. It was not 100% inclusive, especially for people who may not be able to speak or hear, right? Or for other kind of people who may have disabilities. Now, with all of these expectation setting, which we are doing through voices, through the use cases, through making it more human-like, it's also enabling more and more people who are disabled, right? So what is industry doing in specific, in particular, to make their voice assistants more accessible for everyone, regardless of age, ability, and situations? You're on mute.
When we talk about, when we talk about accessibility, there's a few different, what we call them, vectors that we should think about or that we normally have discussions around. So the first one is really around languages. So is it accessible? Because that is the barrier. If you're talking to something, whether you're typing or speaking, can it understand the language? So that's the first one. The second one is, even if it understands the language, can it understand the accent? And this has been particularly high profile because most of the assistants rolled out in the biggest languages. So Mandarin Chinese, English, German, Spanish, right? Spanish actually was a little bit later, but still one of the first ones out there. So you can just look at the world's religion or the world's languages and see which ones have the most people. And those generally got the voice assistant support first. But that covers a significant portion of the world, but not everybody. So languages are important. And then the fact that they were not covering all languages, and then accents were important because people are bilingual, trilingual, could interact in one of the other languages, one of the supported languages, but often had an accent. And so that's one of the areas that they're doing. And I think the key thing there is just getting more data for different types of accents, different types of speech patterns, and just being able to put those into the models so they can improve those, and they have a higher ability to understand that speech. Now, there is a downside too, that the more latitude you provide in understanding different types of sounds to assign to a specific word in a sequence also can lead to more errors overall. So people need to understand that. Like we do live in sort of a world of averages, and humans are much more facile than computers in handling these things. Now, when we come to other types of disabilities, like physical disabilities, so smart speakers are revolutionary for the blind. And we think about a lot of the elderly with macular degeneration. A good friend of mine, like, it transformed his mother's life, being able to put a smart speaker into the home. She was no more as isolated. She could access her books that she couldn't through the phone and such. And so that's really been a tremendous benefit. And we've had a lot more affordances for the sighted who have struggles seeing than we've had historically for the blind, I think, in many cases. And so that's been really important. But then we saw immediately they went to smart displays, and they were able to, right now, I think there's actually a lip reading solution. I think it's Google has that for the Google Nest Hub. They keep changing the names of those, so I have to try to remember that. But I think there is a lip reading feature that can then provide text back on the screen. And so there's some focus on that as well. And we just wrote about a really interesting solution, again, for the blind, but this is for mobility. I think it's the most common way that the blind navigate today is with this standard walking stick. And so most people would recognize it as a long white stick that waves back and forth so you can identify barriers that are in front of the person. And there's a company out of the UK that's added a voice assistant into the handle. And so they can speak with that, and it'll give them information, or it'll give them warnings like, you're going to turn left up here. Now, some of these things people were doing already with earbuds and things like that, but then earbuds attached to a smartphone, again, you have all these problematic affordances around not being sighted or having very low sight or vision. So I think those are some of the areas as well but I would say that the development of voice AI is actually one of the biggest developments for accessibility that we've seen in the digital realm to date. Because before voice, everyone had to learn the interface. So now the interface itself, the digital interface, is actually adjusting to us as opposed to us learning the interface. So that immediately makes digital technology and services more available to more people. But every time you have some advancement, there's certain people who are left behind. And so then you have to layer on all of these other capabilities.
Yeah, totally. So, is there any work being done? I know from the accent standpoint, Google has been doing something. They are also trying to bring in people with some speech disorders and train the data, right? Is there any work being done on the ASL side of things so that people who cannot speak will still be able to use voice assistants in some or the other way?
Well, yes, Google, as you mentioned, has a solution, and I don't remember the name of it, but it can basically train a model to understand people with non-standard speech. And so this would be something where they have some sort of medical speech impediment. Voiceit out of Israel also has a solution that they're building. They're an independent company. So there are people who are definitely working on it. I think there might be actually a couple others in that space. So I think that's important. But the one thing I will say too is that in a lot of these instances, there are visual solutions that are there to help people with the speech impediments. In fact, I was just talking to someone a couple of days ago, and essentially he has a solution that's maybe 10 years old, and it is actually for people who have trouble hearing and sometimes have trouble speaking, but essentially it basically just does real-time transcription in a convenient setting. We've also seen this being used extensively over the last couple of years in language transcription. So there's a number of different companies, like iFlyText, probably one of the biggest ones out of China, but then you also have Google Translator. And we've seen Apple actually introduce something last year specifically for real-time translation to allow these types of things. I think all these affordances are, potentially very useful, but I don't expect because this is predominantly a voice interface and it is based on language that is the way that's traditionally spoken, that I think that there will be significant advancements in that, but I believe that it'll never completely solve the issue of people who don't have speech and being able to interact in that way. I will say that the stuff that Rupal Patel is doing is really interesting, because the idea of a voice prosthesis for people who cannot speak and giving them a way to do that is a really interesting way that they can communicate and they can use these capabilities as well. So as opposed to the technologies that are trying to understand, so the non-understand speech, which is based on a medical impediment or maybe a neurological one. What Rupal is doing is I think is really just fascinating. Over Vocal ID, we should give them credit so people know where to look. The name is Vocal ID. They can type it in, but then it actually speaks it. Now, if they're going to type it and they're going to be interacting with a voice assistant, they don't really need to speak it. They don't need their synthetic voice to speak it, because now you can just type into most or all the voice assistants and they'll respond to you, and that'll be far more efficient. But when they're interacting with a human, it's actually a wonderful solution.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see all of these different kind of solutions empowering so many more people and helping them out for sure. And I've seen a lot more use cases where people who have disability are using voice assistants more and more, up to like help them with their regular setup, and even the basic things which we feel as novelty, like turning on lights and all of those things are like very crucial for them and very important for them, which is kind of great. So talking about use cases, there are so many use cases, and I was just looking through some of the articles in Voicebot. One of the thing which came up was I think New Zealand Police Department have an artificial intelligence solution called Ella. Interesting enough, all the assistants are female. That's a different topic we have to talk about. But then police voice assistant. So what do you think is the purpose of that AI assistant?
Well, when we think about assistants, they all essentially have the same purpose: to assist you. So having one in a police department or a dry cleaner, a restaurant, or in your home, it's the only thing that's different is the use case. So now there was a study done 3 years ago. I should try to dig that up again, where it was in the UK. They'd interviewed people and said, what would you be more comfortable talking about financial problems with, a human or an AI? And AI actually won that survey. And I think in part because people understood that an AI, although I think there's an argument, or there's a discussion, I should say, and it's probably a strong argument in many cases around bias in AI. But when we come to people, we know people carry biases with them, right? The other thing people carry with them is a lot of limitations and situational distractions, right? So the AI doesn't have a sick kid at home. The AI, didn't only get 2 hours of sleep last night. The AI doesn't have all these problems that humans bring. Now, you give up a lot of other affordances when you move to AI, but people understand that if the AI is actually capable, it can be a great way to efficiently transact whatever they need to do to assist them when people aren't available. And people are not always available. We know that. So one great example of a use case that I came across a couple of years ago, I was spending some time with the elder community and services for people who are in retirement communities and other type of living situations. And there's some people who will wake up in the morning and as you say, they can't physically get out of bed by themselves, right? And so what they will do in the current use case, they'll press a buzzer and someone there will come, a nurse maybe, or someone else who works in the living space will come and they will take care of them. They'll open the blinds, they'll turn on the television, whatever it is, help them out, get them set up. With voice assistants now, they could actually just say good morning and the blinds would go up, their news would start playing automatically. It would automatically alert the people at their living residence that they were up and ready. They could even request breakfast. There were a bunch of different things that they could do. This was really liberating. So I mentioned my friend whose mother had macular degeneration. So for her, it helped her re-engage with the world. It's very isolating when you have disabilities, particularly when you're older and you don't have a lot of people around, or you're completely dependent on other people for some things. And so this is where assistants can help us. And I think we're going to see them in all parts of society, because not only do they provide that service, but they don't get tired. They can provide it 24 hours a day. And as long as they are well designed and actually fulfill the need most of the time, it doesn't even have to be all the time, most of the time, many consumers are going to be happy to use them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the next question which comes to my mind as you're talking about this is, how many assistants do we need? Do we need like so many different assistants in different industries and different areas? Or what Alexa did previously, where people can create so many skills and they deployed their Alexa devices everywhere in the hotels and other places as well. So where do you see the industry going in that aspect? Like, will people want to have too many custom assistants to help with different use cases?
Well, the way I look at it is we don't have just one app on our smartphone. So we have multiple apps on our smartphone because each one is specifically designed to solve a particular need, fulfill an intent, if you will. If you're in the voice industry, it might be terminology you like to use. And could we have one app that tried to do everything? Maybe. It probably wouldn't actually scale very well just because of the variety, because the bounded nature of visual interfaces. But with voice, you could. I think it's one of those utopian ideals to have this one assistant that can do it all. But I mean, even if I look at science fiction, where a lot of people's ideas around these things come from, there wasn't just one. I mean, maybe in Space Odyssey, there was one, and maybe it would have been better if there were multiple. But for the most part, there are multiple because they provide different functions. And so I understand from a conversational design standpoint, the concern there that people are going to have to learn different personas, different interaction methods, understanding the boundaries of the capabilities and services. And all those seem like a nightmare to somebody who wants like the perfect solution. But this idea of one assistant to rule them all, I think, is not based in reality. It's not the way the world works. The world is very messy. The world looks a lot more like the App Store than it does some super bot that solves all your problems. So although in theory you could deploy that, I don't think from a practical standpoint, it could ever happen, just because of consumer choice is one, because you're not going to ever be able to design something that solves everybody's problem. And then the other reason is just because of the ability of the people building it to actually provide all of those services. Even if they had a big group of people behind them, they would still prioritize some things over others, which would underserve people, and therefore we lead to the rise of specialists. So my theory is that we use about 9 mobile apps per week on average. We use about 30 per month, might have 100 on your smartphone. That sounds about right. Maybe it might be somewhere half to a third of that, but I don't think it'll be less than that, because specialists tend to win in most markets, and the generalist just can't get to everything to the level of detail a specialist has. And if you have a specific need around a hobby or a profession, or just a certain behavior that you have, or a need that you have, maybe a physical need, you're going to wind up having different solutions that serve you at different points during the day.
Yeah. So from last many years, we've been hearing this thing, right? For example, Alexa and Google Assistant have so many skills you can create. Automotive industry have started thinking about having their own custom assistants, as well as thinking about having multiple assistants in the car, so that people can choose which one they want. So with all of these things, there was a lot of talk about arbitration or coexistence and things like that. Do you see at any point there will be any kind of arbitration, like Google is good at doing certain things, Alexa is good at doing certain things, the vehicle assistant is good at doing certain things? So instead of having multiple assistants, like you mentioned, in an app store kind of setup, there will be an arbitration where when the user says something, the backend system understands like, okay, Alexa is good at doing this thing, so let's arbitrate it to Alexa to do that task for us.
I think arbitration is a great solution for the car. I haven't really thought about it too much for other environments, but for the car, I think it's particularly good, because the chances are that the assistant that's dominant in your car is not going to be the one that's dominant in the rest of your life. It's possible. For that to happen, it would have to be the assistant that's dominant the rest of your life to be in the car. But for that to happen, you have to overcome some disincentives for the people who provide the car. And you also have to understand that the people who are providing the assistant for your entire life are going to have priorities around some things that might not have anything to do with driving, and so might not get to all those features as fast as the model needs to have it in order to be competitive, and all these other things that happen. Because I've worked in the automotive industry, and you must sell cars at all costs, or else you don't sell cars anymore. And so it's extremely competitive. Little differences become big factors in purchase decisions. And so having some control over that user experience is important. One of the things we hear a lot about in terms of custom assistants in the car is that the auto manufacturers are afraid of giving up the data relationship with the customer. And that's true. I don't doubt that at all. I think the bigger issue is actually giving up the user experience, because the user experience, particularly now, the way transportation has been transformed recently, is in the car. It's less and less the drivetrain or the reliability as we start to hit some asymptotic limits on what you can do on 4 wheels on the ground. So then it is the in-car experience, and then to actually just give that to the smartphone provider and say, here, you can have it. That's just going to lead many of these car makers to the ash heap of commoditization. And so that user experience is really important. And that's how so many automakers are differentiating. So I think that's really important. So given that, if the incentive is for the car makers to provide the best driving experience, where the generalist voice assistant players, that's only one of many things that they might be trying to do, they have to understand that when you're in the car, you are not divorced from the rest of your life. So you have certain things you want to do in the car, and that's the Jaguar S-Type, of 2000 had 40 features that you could do in the car. It just didn't contemplate things you would do outside the car because it didn't have the ability to do that. Those still exist, and some new ones have come up. But when you're in the car, you also have all these interests as a human being who has life outside the car. And now with digital connectivity, you can actually address many of those simultaneously, and you can integrate your life. So that's where arbitration, I think, is the best solution for in-car, where you can take the intent in from the user and then smartly route that to whatever service is best suited to fulfill. That might be a general purpose assistant. It might be a locally deployed assistant. It might be a third party that only exists to support the driving experience. All those things, I think, are the reasons why something like arbitration is an excellent solution. It's going to be hard if arbitration can be done effectively and reliably, it would be hard for a single solution that was trying to rely only on its own capability set and those of its integration points to really compete with it.
Totally. I think arbitration could be a good thing in the vehicle setup because, like you mentioned, data is one thing, right? And the other thing, I look at voice assistant as an employee of the company. It represents your brand. So do you want to give away that benefit to some other brand just because they have a better user experience? So that again is another point where I look at arbitration as being something of great use for sure. So
by the way, though, I don't think something like Apple CarPlay is going to go away, or even the traditional deployment of Apple Auto, or excuse me, of Android Auto, because some people will just want that smartphone experience. And I think car makers are smart that they're not going to lose a sale just because someone's a real big Apple CarPlay fan. They'll say, okay, well, you can do that. Or we also have this other assistant that will work with Apple and will work with all these other assistants as well. And we think it's a better experience. But if you just want CarPlay and you love everything else about this car, go for it. Just understand, when you sit in the car and you use a projection technology, you are no better than your phone. And that means you're giving up all these other features that are driving specific that'll never be part of something like CarPlay.
So one more thing talking about this is Alexa did a study recently, I think 2 years back, where people preferred having their personal voice assistant or the one they use at home in the car as well, right? And then there was also one more research, I think it was yours, where people's notion about buying a car or preferences about buying a car also depends on the type of voice assistants in the car, right?
Yes.
So
like, to speak to Amazon's study, they did that with JD Power. And I spoke with Ariane Walker the day that it came out, and we went into some depth on it. In fact, she was on my podcast that very day. In some cases, it depends on how you ask the question, but it also depends on the context and the knowledge base of the person you're asking it to. If their only experience with voice assistants is their car from 2010 and Alexa in the home, they're going to have a very different viewpoint on what they want than if they've used a much more recent manifestation of a custom assistant in the car versus Alexa. The other thing that they're not saying is, like, would you prefer the voice assistant you use in the home if you knew you gave up these 5 features? You couldn't control those with your voice. They don't ask that question, right? And I don't think necessarily that they should. I mean, maybe they should, but I'm not saying that they have to ask that question. But anytime you do this, there are trade-offs. And so you look at the data and you say, okay, what that tells me is sentiment based on what the person's experience are and how the question was asked. So in the Voicebot data, we ask it a little bit differently. And we're looking for sentiment. And we asked a question around voice assistant and their purchase prioritization. And what we do find is that a significant portion, although I've got some recent data. It seems like it's coming down a little bit, although in Europe it's going up more, and in the US it's declining a little bit. And that might just be because they believe that all cars have this and it's all good enough for them. But in any event, without going into too much detail on it, yes, a significant portion of them say, I want my preferred, but it's like 1 in 5 voice assistant. And another significant portion will say, as long as I have one, right? I want one. Like, that's important that the car has one, but they're not specific about it. And so I've never seen something where it's more than 50% said, yes, I want the assistant for my home or my phone in here. And I think most, or at least there's a lot of consumers who are answering that in the affirmative, saying that they want it, also understand that they have Bluetooth connectivity to their phone. So whatever they use on their phone, they can use in the car, regardless of what else comes with it.
Totally. I had the same thing. Like, the data depends completely on how the questions are being asked.
Oh, sure.
So that's totally the thing.
I do market research for a living. Yes. This is very true. Yes, the question is important.
Yeah, definitely. So we're approaching our time. So I have 2 more questions for you. So my podcast name is The Future is Spoken. What does The Future is Spoken mean to you?
Well, it's not the name of my podcast. So I haven't given this as much thought as you have. I understand when I think about a phrase like that, the idea here is that we've lived in an era of mechanical affordances to interact with the technology around us. And that's not just touch and swipe or typing or mechanical typing. This is also, if you look at a car, right? So when we get into a car and we learn to drive it, we learn to drive in the language of the car. It just happens to be a steering wheel, brake, and usually a gas pedal, but now gas is an accelerator, I think we call that now. And that's the language of the car, and you have to adjust to that. There's this concept called the Gutenberg parenthesis. I don't know if your listeners will have come across this, but the idea is that up until the printing press came out in the 1400s, we lived by oral tradition alone. So the past was spoken entirely. There was almost nothing else. There was cave art. There were a few things that people would do, and those were important for communication. But until we had the printing press, we didn't have this revolution of words, and which led to the revolution of typing and this text-based. And so the Gutenberg parenthesis came up actually about 15 years ago when they thought symbols like emojis and other types of things, semiotics might take us away from this text-based stranglehold in our communications. But what happened was that voice assistants came in, and so talking is actually taking it over. And so I think we probably can bracket it. Those are like a 600-year period where we say that was the era of text. Before that, we had voice. Now we have voice, because it is the most efficient way to interact with each other most of the time. Now, there's other things, like there's really big value in publishing and print and text and all these other things. But it's really efficient, and then ultimately it's going to be the most efficient way for people to interact with technology most of the time as well.
Totally. I love that. So, Bret, it was wonderful talking with you. Where can people find more about you?
Okay, so the easiest way is to check out Voicebot.ai. So people listening here probably are podcast fans. So we have a podcast. We're up around 200 episodes, some like really amazing guests on there. So if you go to Voicebot.ai, you hit podcast, you'll be able to see it there or in your favorite podcast player. But we've got news, we've got research. We are doing right now 31 days of charts in Twitter. So you can find me on the Twitter at Bret Kinsella. That's a good place to keep track of all the things we're doing. And maybe they'll see both of us in Clubhouse at some point.
Totally. Yeah. We both are active there. So thank you so much, Bret. It was wonderful talking with you today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/DAA. That's www.witlingo.com/DAA. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer and show notes and more at our website at digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the show notes link. In our next episode, Rana Gujral, CEO of Behavioral Signals, speaks with us about voice-first use cases in fintech. Until next week, take care.